Great to see you all, or at any rate, to be with you virtually today. I'm actually in a very interesting place. You can just see a bit of it here behind my left shoulder, which is Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, which is in the northwest corner of Arkansas. An absolutely beautiful place. I hope some of you have visited or have a chance to visit. And I'm working on an exhibition here for next year. So sorry I can't be with you at Westdean or wherever you are, but it's great that we can commune together here about textiles from across the waves. This is an image of Lenore Tawney, an artist that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. It's a photograph of her that was taken by David Addy in the late 50s. And it's one of the prompts that I had in mind when choosing this theme, rhythm and rhyme in textile art, and the idea of flow as a kind of ordering principle for my remarks today. As I'll talk about in a moment, it's an idea that Tawny herself was very interested in, but it's also been of great interest to me as a theorist and historian of craft. Some of you may know the work of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, if I'm pronouncing that right, who wrote this very well-known and very well-received book called Flow, which argued that the experience of losing oneself in process, effectively entering the process fully, was inseparable from the potency and possibility of skill, and also that the idea of flow as one might conceive it in, let's say, a feedback loop between the hands and the mind and the materials and tools of craft is a defining feature of craft, so that without flow, one in some sense doesn't have craftsmanship, doesn't have skill, which is an interesting way of thinking about it. It's a way of defining craft that has more to do with rhythm, more to do with temporality, more to do with experience, rather than having to do with, let's say, functionality or the question of scale, operating at human scale. So it's an interesting entry point into the larger debate about craft, what it is and why it's important. In terms of textiles, of course, and I'll just shift here to an image of a recent exhibition that was at the Alison Jakes Gallery in London.
Greg, can I just interject, because the image on my screen hasn't changed.
Hasn't it?
No.
Okay.
Something we didn't test before we started meeting. It's changed. Yeah, perfect.
How's that? Okay, great. Let's use this then. Okay, so this is the thanks, Sarah. This is the image of Alison Jakes' exhibition of Lenore Tawney in relation to Toshiko Takeizu, the great Okinawan Japanese an American artist who was a very close friend of Tawney's and worked very much in dialogue with her over the course of several decades in the 1960s and 70s. And it included, as you can see, this work called Peruvian, which is about as conventional a weaving as Tawney ever made, really. You know, it's very rectilinear and very much about the warp and weft matrix, so a kind of right-angled weaving. Although, as you can see, she left these slits that, if you like, pierce or alleviate the relentlessness of the rhythm. And the title Peruvian, very much for her, would have been associated with ancient American textiles of the kind that also inspired Annie Albers and many other post-war weavers. Sheila Hicks would be another great example, who I'll get to in a little bit. But when we think about textile, I think what first perhaps occurs to us is the idea of, if we think about textiles and rhythm, what perhaps first occurs to us is the question of regularity, or the dynamic of regularity, repetition. So the shuttle going back and forth, or even if in a hand process like tapestry, there's the knotting that has a kind of, again, a kind of regularity and consistency to it. And in fact, consistency in tapestry at any rate, and even in machine weaving, is part of what guarantees quality. So even if it's mechanized, we could say that there's still a quality of flow that's at work, and again, a kind of positive feedback loop between the intention of the designer or maker or artist, the materials that are organized into the form, and the shape, the structure. So in a plain weave or twill or a very kind of standard weaving situation, you would have this sense that there's a repetition that's analogous to the repetition of abstraction, the repetition of the machine itself, the repetition of times, seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, years, all of the same length, and so that you feel like you're in this unchanging, predictable structure. But as you could already see, I'll just go back to this first image. Tawny was not just doing that. She was also working in this much more elastic way, particularly here in the late 50s when she's working with what she calls open warp weavings, where she's almost drawing with the warp through a very loosely held, drawing with the weft through a very loosely held warp. And just to show you the context for that, it's very interesting to think about that freedom of mark making in relationship to abstract expressionism, in relationship specifically to Takiezu, who arguably was doing exactly the same thing in ceramics, drawing very much on action painting, contemporaneous abstraction, also drawing on ink painting and calligraphy from East Asia, which of course is where her roots were from. And so you have the sense that there is the regularity of weaving and that kind of flow, but then there's this other kind of flow, which is more intuitive, more improvisatory, more generative possibly, or perhaps just an alternative form generation that's not about predictability and the potency of the loom as a machine, but is rather to do with the possibility of variation and shift and constant changing of mind and changing of direction. So here's just a nice picture of Takiezu and Tawny together in later life, just to kind of visualize that relationship between them. And you can actually see a gridded textile there in the foreground, which is related. This is not Peruvian, but it's very closely related. It's part of a cube that Tawny had hoped to make for the Objects USA exhibition, the famous exhibition that opened in 1969. Ultimately was not able to make it, but she wanted to create this huge minimalist cube, checkerboard on every side. And this is all that was ultimately realized of it. So this very interesting kind of dialogue between that rectilinearity and geometric repetition on the one hand, and then this freer, as I say, improvisatory quality that is so beautifully exemplified by Takiezu. Well, how did Tawny get to this? She began actually later in life than one might suppose. She was married to a gentleman called George Tawny, which is where her last name comes from. And unfortunately, he died during the Second World War, not in battle, but of illness. And she took it upon herself, despite the fact that she was nearing the age of 40, to go to what we now tend to call the New Bauhaus in Chicago. And you can see her here just as an entering student. Fascinatingly, she falsified her age by 17 years at this point. So she claimed to be in her early 20s, even though she was actually, as I say, nearly 40. But she did study there, studied with Mihaly Naj, Leslie Mihaly Naj, the great artist and designer and engineer from the Bauhaus. She recalled that one of the exercises that he had them do was to sign a piece of paper and then make the same shape, the same signature at vast scale, 10 feet wide on a gigantic piece of paper as a way of getting into their own handwriting and experiencing scale shift. It's a very interesting idea and possibly suggestive of the weavings that she would go on to make. She also had a short period of working at Penland School of Craft down in North Carolina with a tapestry weaver from Finland who is called Marta Taipale. This is another picture of Tawny, which I think maybe gives you the sense of why people might have bought the idea that she was in her early 20s. She actually looks like a teenager in this picture. But here's Marta Taipale, visible, but combing down the weft from her warp. And then this is the kind of work that Tawny was making under her tutelage at Penland. So you can see, again, very much standard tapestry weaving, warp and weft in equal proportions, plain tapestry weave. Not even really doing anything with overshot threads here. So this is her learning the craft. But then very, very rapidly, she started to think in a more expansive way about what thread could do. She really was paying increasing attention to paintings, an interest that she had started to develop when she was at the New Bauhaus, and went from this kind of very beautiful, abstract, coloristic work, which almost might make you think of Rothko or other sort of late abstract expressionists thinking about color field, to this kind of thing, which includes much more playful and experimental lengths of thread that cross over the structure of the warps. This piece was just called Triune and is actually in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's also very interesting because at first it might seem as almost like an ecclesiastical tapestry, and in fact the word triune refers presumably to the Christian Trinity, but it also has this cross motif in the center, which of course also could be understood as a Christian motif, but it also could be understood as a kind of giant representation of the warp and weft crossing, and this idea of a kind of DNA that generates the possibility of the rest of the form. And as you can see, starts to bleed, and again looks very much like a color field painting, almost like the way that Helen Frankenthaler was pouring into unsized canvas at the same date. So this would be right in the late 50s. And then ultimately she starts making these open warp weavings, as she calls them. This is a really important example of this technique, which is called Bound Man. It's in the collection of the Museum of Arts and Design in New York City. I think I have a detail of this. You can see just how loose these threads are and how they're hanging in space. Very much what Annie Albers called the event of the thread, or the event of the thread right at this time. Very strong sense that you have a kind of existential attachment to each thread, so each thread marking a moment in this story. Here you have an image that perhaps could be taken as some kind of lynching or wartime image. It makes me also think of Giacometti with this very attenuated black figure. But I hope you can read it. You can see that the figure's hands are bound here to some kind of tree or post, and then the figure is sort of draped down from there. Very kind of disturbing image, very unusual in Tawny's career, and obviously showing some of her artistic ambition at this date, but also this, really radical thing that she wanted to do with weaving. And this is unfortunately, this work doesn't survive, but it shows you how far she wanted to push this and in a way escape the strictures of weaving. So here you have the warps now running horizontally, so she's rotated this 90 degrees, and here are the wefts just coursing through the image, almost like the cord drips in a Morris Louis painting, let's say. And here she is sitting right behind it, leaning over her spool rack, sort of looking off into the distance, very much presented as a visionary. In this article that was actually written by Jack Lerner Larson, the great weaver and textile designer and a close friend of hers. For what it's worth, these open warp weavings, as you can imagine, were very, very fragile, particularly once she started to make them this open. And so what she eventually did was to work with a couple of glass artists called Michael and Francis Higgins in Chicago to actually press them between two panes of transparent glass. Unfortunately, the adhesive that they used over time discolored, and the condition of these works is generally not very good, those that did survive. So they're very rare and not particularly good representations of what she intended. But here in this period photograph, you really do get a great sense of how she was rethinking weaving as a completely painterly practice. Completely painterly practice that had, absolute freedom and was completely detached from the grid. So it's a very interesting way that she's tracking in weaving some of the same things that are happening in painting at this time. Obviously, if you think about something like Jackson Pollock in relation to a pre-war abstraction like Mondrian, you can see a similar set of relationships between the orthogonal grid and then this free, open terrain that often was likened to the American frontier. So this is what Tawny's doing in the late 50s. But I think partly because of the technical challenges and unsatisfying nature of these open warp weavings, and partly because she started to just learn her craft more fully and to develop the possibilities of actually working on the loom itself, she started to make much more structured works that, if you like, sit in a kind of harmonized middle space between the grid and this freedom of gesture, freedom of almost brushstroke that she's creating with the threads. And what's fascinating to me is that this brings her into the domain of rhythm, almost like a musician. And this is a theme that I'll be talking about for the rest of the lecture. The idea that textiles have a musical quality, an internal dynamic of rhythm and rhyme that we could analogize not just to music generally, but to specific kinds of music. And I love this particular image because she looks like she's playing the harp. So, of course, she's manipulating the threads here, but it's almost as if she's trying to get sound out of this work, which is called Vespers and dates from 1961. This is the moment when she has just moved to New York City, and she's fallen into a group of artists that are gathered in a neighborhood called Coenties Slip. There's a great new book about this, by the way, by Prudence Pfeiffer called The Slip, if you're interested. So among her close friends there are Robert Indiana, famous from the Love sculpture, but hasn't made that yet. So this is in the early part of his career when he's sort of a junk sculptor, found object sculptor. Ellsworth Kelly is there, Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg are around the corner, Jack Youngerman, the painter, is her landlord, and then perhaps most importantly, Agnes Martin, who you see here in the white coat, is her closest friend in this community of artists. And here's Agnes Martin, who you can see is wearing quilted clothing to stay warm because these industrial buildings where they were living were completely unheated, and it was a very austere situation. So you can imagine, now Tawny is in her mid to late 40s, widowed, and here she is really having the life of an absolute bohemian. And it's interesting, again, to think about the relationship here between textiles and painting. Often it will be said that Tawny and Martin defined their styles. Obviously, Martin's a very delicate, precise, ethereal, transcendental, gridded style. They defined their styles when they were spending a lot of time together and having a very active exchange of ideas. Although it must also be said that what Tawny's actually doing at this moment, as I said, is to release herself from the grid and to find a way out of that. So that has to be remembered, but certainly looking at a work like this one by Martin, it's hard not to think about it as being woven in some sense and being a kind of metaphorical application of the logic of warp and weft and creating an image out of those intersections. But here's the kind of thing that Tawny is doing at this time. Again, very ethereal, very much like Martin's work. This particular weaving is called lekathos, which is a reference to an ancient Greek pouring vessel. So a kind of classical allusion, and very much has to do with the idea of flow of a different kind. So it's important to say that Coenties Slip is right there on the East River. So she's looking out her window while making this work on the water flowing past, and the Staten Island ferry, and thinking about that movement, thinking about that constant motion, and really somehow channeling that in her work, allowing that to flow into her work. This is a particularly good example of that, as is this one, which is actually called Little River. It's one of a series of works that she did with river-related themes and titles. And these are the what she called her woven forms, these very ambitious, this would be something like 12 feet tall, so very large scale, very rhythmic works that use the phrasing of different loom-based structures as a way to articulate a kind of temporality and a kind of spatial interval across the full height or full length, if you like, of the work. You might be wondering how she did this, and I'm not a technical expert on this, but what she did in brief is to put an adjustable reed on the head of the loom that allowed her to move the warps by one position to the left or right from one weft pass to the next, as a way of introducing these kind of diagonal vectors into the weaving. So basically to allow it to expand and contract. Here you see a detail of this, which hopefully makes this a little clearer. So basically what you have are these kind of almost like tape weavings that are held apart at different distances, depending on how she's manipulating that reed, which allows her to create this very strong visual sense of the water flowing through the river. So it's a kind of diagrammatic or representational work in that sense. She would also often talk about it as a kind of breathing, which is a very important thing to her as a very serious practitioner of meditation. And so she would talk about a work like this one that went from a very tight knotted top to a larger expansive middle to, again, a tighter fringed bottom. She would talk about it as being like an inhalation and exhalation. So you can almost imagine this being, one intake of breath and one exhalation of breath. That duration being the spirit of the work, and of course, breath being the spirit of life, or the rhythm of life itself. And she's thinking very deeply about these works in relation to her spiritual practice, and then varying them and exploring different possible configurations of these techniques and of this kind of dynamic that she's exploring. You can see she's also including feathers, which again have to do with this idea of life and air and flight and movement, through the sky rather than through the water. This is an exhibition she did in 1963 called Woven Forms that was at the Museum of Contemporary Crafts, also one of Sheila Hicks' first exhibitions, by the way, in New York City, who I'll get to in a second. And you can see these amazing works that she starts to hang in free space, so you can walk around them. They're no longer wall hangings or tapestries in a traditional sense, but really free sculpture in free space. And again, very interesting to see her manipulating these threads completely loose from any binding structure. This is Lekathos again, that piece that I showed you earlier, and she's combing her hand through it, and yet at the same time has the kind of integral logic that's imposed by the loom, the matrix of the loom. So it's a kind of relationship to structure and to rhythm and to internal rhyme that you might also think about in jazz, bebop jazz, of course, being very popular at this time, or in her case, maybe medieval chant would also be an interesting analogy, because it's a sustained melodic quality, and the idea that the tone of the work is being carried across space and across time. So improvisation, but also a kind of dedication and consistency to the form. I think it's also just important to remember, and you all will know this very well, that she's only looking at a very small length of these works as she's making them. So this particular group of work, these are going to be something like 17, 18 feet tall. These are really huge ones, which are the largest ones that she did. But she's only ever seeing, maybe 2 feet of them in front of her on the loom. So it's not until she's actually woven the entire object and then unrolled it that she has a sense of its composition. So she's really holding it in her mind, allowing that, encouraging herself to stretch out imaginatively, if you like. Finally, just the last thing on Tawny is that at the end of her career, she starts to explore what she calls her clouds, which are ceilings of fabric that have individual threads knotted into them and that are allowed to drape to the floor often, or into the space of the room. Sometimes she would also hand paint some of the threads beforehand to create these kind of auras or atmospheric effects in the middle of these clouds. Interestingly, in relation to my theme of music in relation to textiles, they were actually used as a set for dance on one occasion in the late 70s. So as if she had kind of created a theatrical space for this kind of meditative spinning dance that a choreographer friend of hers did. And then here's a late one, large example of this that we put on display in the Kohler Art Center when we did an exhibition about Lenore Tawney a few years ago. And so this is, now taking the logic of weaving and dispensing with the weft entirely. So you really have only warp threads, if you like. So you could say it's not a weaving anymore at all. It's just a rainfall of threads. But also then three-dimensionalizing that and making it into a kind of geometric block. But of course, the threads are completely free within that shape that she's imposed. And so when you walk around an artwork like this one, and I remember very clearly having this experience with this particular example, this large cloud, the threads will move in relation in response to any movement of air in the room, including your own passage around the work. And so it's almost like you are yourself setting up the flow or the currents inside the work. That is, again, analogous to the movement of water through a river or through a lake or a sea. And then again, the movement of air being related to the movement of air into your own lungs and passing out again as exhalation. So there's a very kind of deep sense in which these cloud works, also thinking of their title, these vapor sculptures that are hanging in the air up above us. This is sort of all bound into this sense of commonality and cosmic unity with movement, with time, with space, but through a very, very simple single technique of just knotting that thread into the roof of the sculpture and then allowing it to hang down. So this gives you a very good sense of how one particular artist has thought about flow and rhythm and internal rhyme across the course of her own long career. And I'm not going to say anything like that much about the other artists that I want to talk about. I'll just be showing you a couple of slides of each one of them. But I just wanted to explore with you the question of how different sorts of rhythm can be, again, compared to other kinds of music, and also to the idea of phrasing, as we might have in poetry, for example. So there was Sheila Hicks, and here's one of the works in her Principal Wife series, which is the title being an allusion to an ancient myth about the principal wife of a king. And I start with this because it's such a clear example of how, again, tight stricture, restraint, and then looseness can be used in a very simple way to create this highly complex generative form. So what I mean is that, as you can see, she's wrapping the fall of the threads in this synthetic thread, which has a metallic quality to it, very similar to the kind of lurex and other synthetic threads that Dorothy Liebes and other weavers were using right when Hicks would have entered the field in the 1950s. And then she's allowing the vertical threads to these bundles to show their looseness between, and then using that very simple binary structure as a way of creating the phrasing of the work. And sometimes, as you can see, she's also splitting the fall of the threads, so she's dividing them into two, or in other works, sometimes three or more of these passages. And again, one thinks, of course, of rainfall, just like the clouds of Tawny. One might again think of a river or perhaps a waterfall when looking at these. But what I think most about is, in fact, musicality and musical composition. In fact, you could even say it looks a little bit like a musical score, sort of turned on its side, a staff of notes. And you think about how you might play it, if you were a musician yourself, of a sort of John Cage mindset. Could you actually take a piano or another instrument and play this work, accept it as a composition that you could then perform in some way? And I think that's so true of so many of Hicks's works. This is her more recently with one of these works that's, again, still looser, but again, involving wrapping of threads around textiles. And again, although of course it's very sculptural and it's very much about color and the relationship between textiles and painting, again, we might also think of it as being like a giant musical instrument. In fact, it reminds me of nothing so much as organ pipes. And you think about each of them having their own pitch. So the smaller ones, the more slender ones, being the kind of soprano end of the range, and then the larger, fatter ones being like the bass chords. And bringing all of these together into one composition again is almost orchestral in its intention. Might also think about someone like Françoise Grossin, the great French fiber artist, very much a colleague of Hicks's and Tawny's, although somewhat younger. And a work like this one, again, is having this quality of very, very strong repetition, but also variation. So here we might think about instead something like a Bach suite, and the way that he would use theme and variation, or these canon structures, to create repetition, but also change and development within repetition. So at first you think of this as just 5 identical forms, and very related to contemporaneous minimalism in that regard. But then when you look at them more carefully, you can see that, of course, the individual lengths of the yarns are different, and it creates these very subtle modulations of the form. So, for example, look at where the braids fall. So here, on if you look at the rightmost element, it falls down to the left of it. Here, on the second to the right, it falls down the center. Over here, all the way on the left, it's sort of draped across. So you have these what initially seems like the same thing over and over again, actually taking on this wonderful life, wonderful organicism, what David Pye in his theorization of craft called diversity, so the handmadeness imposing a kind of diversity and liveliness in our environment. Then shifting somewhat radically in terms of artistic context and also in terms of the language of the textile construction, we might also think about quilting as having a very similar quality of variation within repetition, or theme and variation, as a musician might call it. And this is a perfect example of that. It's a quilt, as you can see, by Jessie Telfair, who was very involved in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And then later on in her life made this quilt, and this had been made in the early 80s, but looking back at her experiences as an activist, I liked this one so much that I actually put it on the cover of my book, as you can see. But what she's thinking about here is the cadence of people that are marching in a protest. And what she did was to take the designs from this, decades old sort of how-to book on quilting to make these block letters, and she applied those to this kind of Martin Luther King Jr.-esque chant, freedom. What do we want? Freedom. When do we want it? Now. That kind of idea. And you again feel the cadence of that cascading down the form, but also the individuality, because each letter, each repetition of the word is slightly different. So it almost feels like the same person saying freedom over and over again, or possibly a lot of people chanting this word all at once in unison, and each of their voices being a little bit different. And quilting, of course, has this quality of being incantatory and being related to the human voice, related to the idea of improvisation, very much so. And of course, you immediately think here of the quilts of Gee's Bend, and particularly the ones that are made of work clothes that were done really before the quilts were discovered by collectors and museums and curators and writers like me, when they were really, utilitarian textiles made in very economically straitened circumstances. And here I hope you can see what you're looking at is the denim legs of jeans that have been patched, and then the jeans ultimately became so worn that they couldn't be used anymore for daily labor. And so artists like Letitia Petway would take these garments, cut them up, and make them into these absolutely amazing, beautiful designs, very intuitively, but very, very ingeniously, and with a great deal of formal intelligence. And again, you can see the way that phrasing works here. So the punctuation that the patches impose on what's otherwise the repetition of the shape of that denim leg as it's repeated across the surface of the quilt. Here's just a reminder of the kind of setting that these objects are made in, to give you a sense of the kind of fullness and the fact that they're living in these collaged spaces in a way that are re-expressed in the quilts. And then ultimately you get master quilters, really just absolute geniuses of improvised form, like Mary Lee Bendolph, who's breaking up the block of the quilt, so retaining the house top and the other the sunburst and the other traditional patterns, but varying the scale of them, allowing them to stretch out. And this is so much like the way that let's say a blues musician might work with a very standard 1-4-5 chord progression and the repetitious structures of a particular song, but allow it to blossom into this exploratory terrain of possibility through the bending of the notes, through the stretching out of the rhythm, through the simple fact of individualistic personal expression. And another absolutely stunning Bendolph example here, showing what she's doing with this work clothes vocabulary. Also bringing in these floral textiles, which also makes you think about gender play and the way that male and female work are being sort of captured here as content. So it's also I'm really speaking formally here, but I think we should remember that these quilts and really all the works that I'm showing you today also have a kind of social and cultural content. I just want to tell a quick story, which is that when I was at the Milwaukee Art Museum in 2003, there was an exhibition of Gee's Bend's quilts that came originally from the Houston Museum of Fine Arts, and it went to the Whitney, where it was very celebrated and took the New York art world by storm. And then a version of that show later made it to Milwaukee when I was there. And the quilt makers were touring the museum with a colleague of mine. I unfortunately wasn't there for this, but she repeated the story to me. And they passed by this Richard Diebenkorn painting on the right-hand side. So it's this specific painting. And one of them looked at it and said, that would make a really good quilt, which is such a great reversal, because what people had been saying was that these women had, as it were, sprung from the soil of Alabama, unbidden, like Athena from the head of Zeus or something, and had made these abstractions in some sort of magical way. But of course, that dialogue goes both ways, and we should remember that quilts were abstract a long time before paintings were. And if we really want to understand the trajectory and history of abstraction, we probably should be looking at textiles and ceramics and other craft mediums as having primacy in that field before the likes of Kandinsky and Mondrian and then ultimately Diebenkorn ever came along, for what it's worth. Okay, now get off my soapbox and just talk about a few more last examples of artists that are working with this logic now. So beginning here with Sanford Biggers, who to my mind is taking this idea from the quilt makers of previous generations and updating it, as he would be the first to say, to the era of hip hop. And so what he's thinking about is the way that sampling and the other technical features of hip hop, the break, which is the so-called instrumental, of course, is entirely done with turntables and records, but breaking from the vocal and having this kind of extended, again, arena of exploration, rhythmic exploration, can be translated into this textile form. It's also worth saying that just as the Gee's Bend quilters are appropriating work clothes and then integrating that into their work, what he's doing, maybe a bit more shockingly, is to take existing quilts, historic quilts, some of them 19th century quilts, and cut them up and make them into these paintings. So he's sampling them in a very literal sense, which has been perhaps rightly controversial, but certainly has a kind of logic to it that allows him to sweep the cultural connotations of these objects into his work in the same way that, Public Enemy sampling a news report would, for example. So the use of sampling as a kind of neo-Duchampian sound-based found object, having a kind of critical capacity, both in the case of hip-hop music and in his work. And then I also wanted to talk about Diedrich Bracken's wonderful artist, originally from Texas, who has been making the most extraordinary weavings. I hope some of you would know his work. Interestingly, positioned between quilt making and weaving, so they are entirely woven on looms, but he's obviously, as you can see here, referring to quilt patterning in composing his work. And he's then doing these wonderful, thoughtful, sensitive, figural representations, which very often seem like self-portraiture. He's a very slender black man, so the figures, which are also slender and black, read very much as being allegorical representations of himself. Although, again, we might think about Tawney's Bound Man and Giacometti's figures and think about a longer art historical trajectory for these. But look at the way that he's breaking up the weave here to create this kind of negative/positive space and this image of embrace in this particular work, for example, and how sophisticated his use of color and, again, rhythm is in this pictorial weaving. Very influenced also by vernacular African-American art, for example, the work of Bill Traylor that you can see on the left here, and taking these emblematic, highly charged symbolic images like the horse here and placing them into the matrix. So, he's not using open warp here, but he's also drawing in some way with the threads. And I see a lot of commonality between what he's doing here and what Tawney was doing in her pictorial weavings of the late 1950s, like Bound Man, as I just mentioned. And then another thing that is, I think, very relevant about Diedrich's practice in this context, Diedrich Bracken's practice in this context, is that he's also a poet. So he is thinking a lot about language and, of course, rhythm, because rhythm is so much a part of poetry. And the poetry itself is very oriented, at least in my reading, to blues traditions. And this is a very good example of this. So a work from a few years ago called Heaven is a Muddy Riverbed, and he created this poem at the same time. And they kind of correlate to one another. The subject matter here is it's very tragic, actually. It's a group of 3 boys that were killed in police custody in 1981 in Texas near his hometown. And he thought of them, they were drowned in a lake seemingly by the police. And he thought of them as being like catfish and as spirits that were still in the lake when he was growing up. And so he wrote this beautiful poem about that. And, you think about the way that each line, the weft crossing over the weaving and the duration of that and the extent of that being like the line of the poem, and a poem as being like a weaving in some sense. So each line being like the weft, and then the sense of it, the drive of it, the continuity of thought being like the warp. And so again, you get a very strong metaphorical relationship there. But of course, poems are also like song lyrics, and you can imagine this perhaps being set to music. So it's a whole collection of different mediums here that are abiding by the same logic, you could say. And then finally, last but not least, I just wanted to talk about Jeffrey Gibson, who you probably will all know from, if nothing else, from his recent representation of America at the Venice Biennale a couple of years ago. I wrote a big article for Crafts magazine, the late lamented Crafts magazine, last year about it. And he's another artist who works very thoughtfully and in a very sustained way with textile forms. He started as a painter, and some of his early works, as you can see here, actually painted skins. But ultimately, he became known for beadwork above all. This is actually a work that's here at Crystal Bridges, the one on the left, What We Want, What We Need, which is an allusion to, in fact, to Public Enemy, who I just mentioned, but also via Public Enemy to James Brown. And then on the right here is this punching bag has emblazoned on it the slogan, "I Put a Spell on You," which is a reference originally to a Screaming Jay Hawkins blues song, although you might know it from the Creedence Clearwater Revival cover, but it's originally a blues song by a Black musician. And so here you have a Native American artist, Choctaw Cherokee heritage, using funk and disco and blues lyrics, but also using Native American beadwork and creating this syncretic cultural aesthetic, this idiom. So here he is at the Venice Biennale. I'm sure many of you have seen this. This is the exhibition was called the Space in Which to Place Me, and really raising the question of national identity. Here he is, the first Native American who's represented the country at the Venice Biennale. He uses the slogans of the country, like "We hold these truths to be self-evident," which is what it says on the right-hand side here. These flags that sort of look like national flags, but also are very personalized on the exterior. And then you have these plinths, which look as though they should hold sculptures, perhaps, sculptures of the likes of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, but instead are empty and were used by Native American performers during the run of the biennial. And here we are inside. Another slogan, "We are made by history," these kind of guardian figures with more of this language, "We want to be free," again, a song lyric. And then as you explore the exhibition, he integrated historic textiles, rather like Sanford Biggers, and integrating historic quilts and put them in relationship to language. So here you have the slogan "Powerful Nation," for example, which could be a reference to the Native American nation. It could be in relation to the United States, could be a reference to Black nationalism. I was thinking here about the Public Enemy album, It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back. So that might be another association. And ultimately, what he's doing here is to create an unstable portrait of America, which is refracted through this kaleidoscopic, rainbow-hued iconography that I think for him is very strongly related to disco and to nightclubs and to the experience of dancing under the lights, the music pumping, the sweat pouring, the other bodies in the space, the darkness and the illumination that you have both inside your head and outside your body. And his show kind of felt like that. It was like a sort of stilled nightclub, if you like. Whenever thinking about Gibson, I apologize if some of you have seen me talk about this work before, because I feel like I always end my talks with it. And in fact, I ended my book, Craft in American History, with it as well. But it's just so beautiful and so powerful and so apt for so many topics. What it says, if you can't read it, is American history is longer, larger, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it. And then it's JB because of James Baldwin, who was the person who said this originally. And so, so many things we could say about this. Again, it relates to quilting, relates to Native American beadwork. These are jingles like you would have in a powwow costume down at the bottom underneath the quotation. Relates to signage, Jenny Holzer, text pieces. There's a lot of things you could bring to this work. But for the purposes of today's talk, I just want to notice that, again, he's turned a quotation from prose into something that's like a poem, with these lines cascading down, as I said, with Diedrich Bracken's, placing that within the up-down, left-right logic of the weaving, allowing the yarns to drape at the bottom, very much, again, like Tawny, so the tight structure and then the openness, or Sheila Hicks, and the sheer musicality of this, the way that rhythm here functions not only visually and formally, but also as a kind of statement about the passage of time, the passage of history itself, the rhythm of the American past, present, and future, the way that we're caught up in those bigger shapes, and the awe-inspiring, gorgeous, horrific dimensionality of all of that seems to be captured in this one work. And it just shows you how much you can do with textiles and interval and time, and how much there is to say with textiles, and therefore why it deserves so much to be taken seriously as any other artistic medium: painting, sculpture, architecture. It's our most ancient artwork, our most ancient art form, and in some ways perhaps still the one that has the most potential embedded within it. So I'm going to leave my talk there and invite any questions that you may have. Thanks very much for listening. And I'll be curious to hear your thoughts.
Thanks for that, Glenn. We've got a few questions in the Q&A. That was really interesting. We've got quite a practical question to begin with, which was, how does one transport a piece such as the Clouds of Tawny with so many single loose hanging threads?
That is a great question. So it's a very labor-intensive artwork, not just to make, but also to transport and to install. So believe it or not, it's basically exactly what you would think. So you roll up each thread and tie it off. And then, having done that hundreds or thousands of times, probably hundreds of times, you then roll the whole thing into a bundle, and then it's very easy to ship. And that's one of the magical things about it, actually, because it's an artwork that can fill a whole gallery that you can ship for almost nothing, and is soft and impossible to damage unless you got it wet. It's really magical thinking, but it's incredibly labor intensive.
Yeah, I can imagine that. And then we have another question in relation to Tawny and Hicks especially. Is there a useful distinction in terms of how the experience of flow and musicality might differ for an individual musician, the ensemble or collective, especially in free improvisation, and the experience of the audience?
Yeah, that's a very interesting area to explore. Mostly what I've been thinking about here is that the weaver is like a musician or a composer or both. Obviously, that's a fluid line, especially when you get to improvisatory music like jazz, because you're composing on the fly. I do think it is particularly with Hicks, because she's working at such scale and with assistants also. Let's not forget, she's not doing all of that by hand herself, right? So there you might think about her as being like the conductor of an orchestra, which I sort of alluded to, but it's a great question because it brings that out a little bit more. And that would certainly be true of someone like Gibson as well. So I think if I were going to explore that in writing, if I were to write an essay about this, let's say, I think I would probably want to literally focus on how the artist is operating within a collective or a team, and then think about how they work as a composer or even a conductor of that team. But it's another way that you could apply the logic of music, because obviously music is so often a matter of multiple people finding a means of joint expression.
Yeah, interesting. I actually found the cube, the Tawny cube, super interesting because from my perspective, I kind of trained quite traditionally as a blacksmith, and so very much like skill building and, repetitive kind of work, and technicality is something that I just can't get away from in what I love about objects. I love things that have been made in ways which I find really hard to understand, and which is then like a puzzle of like, how did they do that? And just really pushing like the technical boundaries along with the conceptual kind of boundaries. And so that kind of like, the threads are not even knotted, it kind of almost disassembled as a piece. Like, it's kind of really interesting to me. How was that received by other weavers at the time when it came out? Did they sort of react to it in the same way as like the art kind of critic world? Were there any differences in how it was kind of perceived by different groups of people?
Well, I think it's important to remember that by that point, Tawny is in her 80s and she is the revered master. So she is still very much trapped within, it's a situation that we seem finally to be liberated from, and it's incredible that it took us this long. But she's still very much trapped within a scenario of rigid separation between weaving and other art forms. So the reception of her work, even at the end of her career, and she did live to be, 100-ish, she was still very much thought of as the great fiber artist, but she wasn't necessarily understood as being a post-minimalist, let's say, or contextualized in some other way. So I think everyone understood those clouds to be the kind of brilliant resolution of her career, in the same way that Monet's late water lilies were, let's say. And people would have made that comparison. So people didn't have a hard time with them within the weaving world because of who she was probably. But they definitely were not received by the broader art world in the way that they should have been. And that's much more recent, taken a long time since her death. Yeah.
And do you think that's because it was still kind of perceived as like women's work, and sort of having that domestic kind of association of
100%.
That a lot of,
Yeah, and also, it's also because of where she had come from and what her affiliations had been and what the institutional footing of that work was. People would have seen that work not at the Guggenheim; they would have seen it at the American Craft Museum, now the Museum of Arts and Design, right? So it's also the way that institutions set up expectations and a contextual reception, and that's why it's so important that you have, a gallery like Alison Jake's, which is in every way a kind of exploratory cross-media fine art gallery, showing Tawny and Takezu's work, or here at Crystal Bridges for that matter. The open-mindedness of the institutions really leads the market, but also individual response.
I think we do have a new question. Can the artwork be read as a score in itself, such as a graphic score which develops its own language and invites a specific criteria for interpretation, something to be performed from?
Yeah, I love that idea. I mentioned it just briefly with relation to Hicks's principal wife, that you could think of that as being like staff music. But also if you think about the way that John Cage and other composers of his period, Morton Feldman, the kind of avant-garde composers of that time, Cornelius Cardew, actually, let's not forget. So Michael Cardew, the potter, his son, the avant-garde composer, the way that they would make scores that were themselves, that looked like artworks in their own right, and had a kind of unconventionality and therefore demanded to be interpreted in a freer way because the mark making was not held within a stable code, and so that calls upon the musician to react in a kind of open, creative way. And I would love to, if I were curating around this topic, I would love to, put a lot of fiber artworks into a room and then ask a group of composers or musicians to interpret them as sound. I think that would be a great project. Yeah,
that would be fun. Somebody's asked, could you recommend any reading on the idea of flow and rhythm in craft and comparing it to the performing arts?
Yeah, absolutely. So right at the beginning, I mentioned the book Flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. Don't ask me to spell it, but it's called Flow. You'll find it. It's a very well-known book. Also, Richard Sennett's book, The Craftsman, has a lot of great stuff on that. If people remember that from about 10 years ago, it made a big impact at the time. And he is himself a musician. I believe he plays the cello, if I'm remembering correctly. And he has a lot to say about the relationship between craft as a making practice and as a performing practice. It maybe gets to be a little bit more of an analogy than because I don't actually think of playing the cello as being a craft per se, because I think craft to me, craft does imply an act of physical making in a material.
Yeah.
Discuss. I mean, that's a big topic, but like, what is craft anyway? I always say craft is skilled making at human scale is my definition of craft. So that doesn't really include playing the cello, I would have thought, but that's not really what Sennett's interested in. He's interested in questions of personal responsibility and that kind of scale. So he's also interested in like computer coding. So that's a really good thing to read on this. And then if you haven't seen the book we did on Lenore Tawney, I definitely would recommend that. We went into that quite deeply. And there's a lot of great stuff in there. Also, Toshiko Takezu, the book that we did on Takezu, we had a really great contribution from a composer, which I didn't go into here because it's ceramics rather than textile. But we had a composer thinking about her clothes forms that have rattles in them and actually thinking about those ceramics as being like musical instruments. So there's some good stuff in there too.
Yeah. And then we've got another question from David, and he says for him there's a link between minimal repetition in music and a certain kind of labour or attention, especially when you're performing it. And he wonders if there might be an interesting association with the tension of a weaving itself, an interesting topic when the works are taken off the loom, and I guess the tension is released at that point. And he was wondering if you could maybe say something about that.
Oh, I love that, David. And in fact, thinking back to Tawny's open warp weavings, one of the points about them is that they're not held in tension when she's working with them. As you could see, she's just got a loose fall of threads and she's passing through them. So she's, that's a great point, that the tension of the loom and the tension also of the body and the labor that this one's committed to, that would be true in a musical performance context as well, because if you're playing the same four notes in the same shape over and over and over again and maybe just getting slightly louder over the period of 5 minutes, which is something Steve Reich might have a musician doing, that is a lot like weaving and what the demands that it places on you. It's also very interesting to me that because David, I'm so glad you asked this, because it makes me think about a different conception of skill than what we're used to, in the sense that I think when we normally conceptualize skill, what we tend to go towards is a kind of fast bravura gesture, or a kind of single act of control. And that could be true in making, it could be true in music, it could be true in sports, whatever it is. It's like something that is gone in a flash, and it's like, oh wow, did you see what they did? Flicking off this extraordinary Paganini run on a violin or whatever. But there's another version of skill which has to do more with endurance, consistency, precision, painstakingness, that I actually do associate more with craft in general, and especially with weaving. And it's almost diagrammed or tracked or recorded in the finished object.
Yeah.
Which is a great point. And it gets you into like questions of psychology and embodiment as a way of extending these ideas. Yeah.
Yeah. I seem to remember in one of your books you talk about a challenge, and the kind of almost the ultimate craft challenge is if a glassblower was asked, you got a number of glassblowers to make the same item, and whoever made it the closest to the original specification, that was kind of almost the ultimate embodiment of like a craft skill.
Yeah, that's a related idea that copying would be the strictest test, because what you'd be eliminating there is all the other things that a craftsperson might be thinking about, but aren't necessarily the essence of what craft is. And again, this gets controversial, but if you think about craft as, again, skilled making at human scale, I haven't actually said anything there about innovation or creativity or expression. Like all that stuff might be built on the structure of craft in the same way that a house is built on a foundation, in fact. So absolutely essential to the expression. But the fact of being able to do it at all, if you think that's what craft really is, then copying would be a great test.
Yeah, which I find very interesting. Because so many of the people I know, that's like the core part of their role, being able to, you know, if you're a blacksmith making a gate, you have to be able to make the same element
absolutely
to exactly the same shape and size. Otherwise, you know, your gate's going to look ridiculous at the end.
And by the way, if you don't mind me getting back on my soapbox briefly, I also think that there's an important thing there about the ethics of craft and the reason that they stand apart from, for sure, and maybe to some extent in opposition to capitalistic ethics, just in the sense that capitalism is, of course, premised on return on investment and constant growth, and actually is not oriented towards repetition. It's oriented more towards, as Joseph Schlumberger famously said, creative destruction, right?
Yeah.
And so the idea that craft would be about remaking and repetition and faithfulness and a kind of loyalty to precedent, that is a really good sign of why it constitutes this alternative set of values and culture. So although the idea of craft as copying initially seems more like that makes you think about conservatism or a kind of paralysis, maybe. There's another way you could think about it that has to do more with, not pursuing novelty for its own sake, but instead understanding inherent value and preserving it.
Yeah. Which I guess for weavers, you know, they're always working with a lot of the same tools a lot of the time. I can imagine, you know, they're always working with looms and sort of the same kind of techniques and things like that. So there is like that thread, if you'll excuse the pun, running through it always. But then you can be really, you know, conceptually adventurous with that. But there's always that common core.
Yeah, so there's a spectrum there. I mean, at one end you would have the glassblower making exactly the same thing in the same way, and can you do it? But then, of course, there's a broader question there about repetitive structures or just techniques that can be applied and reapplied, and these deep rhythms and currents of craft that have to do with various forms of continuity, all of which stand against the kind of relentless, you know, in fact, also what we're seeing a lot in our politics right now, right? Like sort of, you know, the sort of Elon Musk version of leadership is just burn things down and hopefully something better will happen. And, you know, I kind of feel like what we're learning is that it's something we already knew, which is a lot easier to burn down a village than build one. And craft, of course, is the building part. It's not the burning things down part. So that explains a lot about why it is so strongly politically aligned in a certain direction.